We're taking a closer look again at the Shroud of Turin today from a nuclear physicist's perspective, and also taking a look at a bunch of your questions as well. I'll be right back. Gracious gang, gracious gang, gracious gang. It's Mike Creevy, the host of the Gracious Guest Show, and I'm so delighted that you're here today. Check out the website, thegraciousguest.org, for all kinds of great content, more links, previous videos and podcasts, other kind of content. Also, make sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel if you're watching us on YouTube. Like the content, share it far and wide with somebody today that you think will benefit from it. Also, if you're listening on the podcast, thank you so much for joining us that way, and spread the word. Share the link. Okay, that'll help us out a lot. And as well, ratings and reviews, good ratings and reviews as well. Wherever you can do those things, please go ahead and do that. Helps the show quite a bit. I want to jump into this interview here today pretty quickly here without a lot of background. Mr. Bob Rucker was so gracious to come back on with us. And Bob has really been gaining quite a reputation in shroud circles over the past decade or so, as he, in his retirement, has really set his sights on all things shroud from especially a nuclear physicist's perspective. Bob spent 38 years in the nuclear industry, and as the information about the shroud's carbon dating really in the late 80s started to kind of come out, it really piqued his interest because he noticed some irregularities and some things from his own expertise that he thought were important to bring to the table. And really in the last, as I said, decade or so, Bob has just been publishing a tremendous amount of papers, doing a lot of research, and he's showing up more and more on the podcasting and sort of shroud interview video world as well. His previous video, which I have linked at the end of this one, and I also have it linked over here for you, was one of the most popular videos that we've ever released here from this channel before, and definitely want to encourage you to check that one out in more detail. And then in this interview, Bob's going to take up quite a few of the questions that have come up since that video was put out, and to try to explore them and to make some good arguments basically to kind of counter in some cases some of the criticism that his work has received in some regards, and also to introduce really the evidence once more to a lot of folks that might be seeing this for the first time. So I really am excited to share this interview with Mr. Bob Rucker on the Shroud of Turin. So check it out. Well, Bob Rucker, it's a delight to have you back on the Gracious Guest Show.
Yes, thank you for inviting me.
Well, yeah, anytime. Yeah, and this is something I was just talking to you before we started recording, that when I had you back on about 7 months ago, I think it was, that video just went crazy on YouTube. A lot of people interested in what you had to say, and sort of the follow-up, of course, on there. But before we kind of dig in and pick up in a sense where we left off, and really look at some of the questions as well that people have been submitting about that conversation and some other related shroud things, I thought if you could just recap for the audience here a little briefly about your own background and sort of how you became involved in this shroud study yourself.
Yes, okay. And this was covered more thoroughly in the previous podcast, but I became interested, first learned about the shroud when I was about 12 or 13 years old, when a magazine came out in the newspaper, and I saw a little a picture, maybe an inch and a quarter high, and a little tiny paragraph next to it. And the last sentence said, many people believe that this image of the face is of the authentic burial cloth of Jesus. And I thought that can't possibly be the case, because it would be so well known. Why would you talk about anything else?
Right.
You know? But then I thought I needed to be a little bit more open-minded than that. And so when I found books on the Shroud of Turin in bookstores, and I bought them and read them. So that's my background and on how I came to know about the shroud. Then I was always interested in nuclear physics and nuclear engineering, and then earned a bachelor's and master's degree from University of Michigan in nuclear engineering, and worked for 38 years in the nuclear industry, mostly running nuclear analysis, computer calculations for nuclear reactor design and something called criticality safety. So that's the background. What we talked about last podcast was my concept of explaining the carbon dating using what I call the neutron absorption hypothesis, where neutrons were emitted in a burst of radiation from the body so that those neutrons then would have exited the body, gone into the limestone, bounced around, formed a characteristic distribution in the tomb, which is then consistent with the different dates that were obtained from the 3 different laboratories that were sent samples from the Shroud of Turin. And that brings us up to data to about 3 years ago, when I started trying to expand that neutron absorption hypothesis into something that would also include image formation, because the image formation is the most difficult thing to explain.
Yes.
And so I have developed a concept for image formation. I call it the VCRB hypothesis, vertically collimated radiation burst hypothesis. So that what I'm saying is that the evidence seems to indicate that the images were formed by charged particles emitted from the body, probably protons, because protons in a 170 to 175 pound body, I calculated that there would be 2 times 10 to the 28th neutrons. That's 2 followed by 28 zeros. Lots of neutrons.
Yes.
And so if neutrons were emitted from the body that caused the carbon dating to date the shroud to 1260 to 1390, then it would take, how many neutrons would it take to do that? Well, it would take 2 times 10 to the 10 to the 13th, I believe it was, neutrons, which is just 1 neutron for every 10 billion that were in the body. So it'd just be a very small fraction of the neutrons that would have to be emitted. Now, well, how would they be emitted? Well, most likely from a splitting of nuclei or fission of nuclei in the body, because that's where the neutrons are. They're in the many different nuclei of the many different isotopes in the human body. And so the isotope that would require the least energy to split the nuclei would be deuterium, which is also called heavy hydrogen. Normal hydrogen just has a proton in the nucleus, whereas heavy hydrogen, this form of isotope of hydrogen, has both a proton and a neutron, which makes it about twice as heavy as a normal hydrogen. Very small fraction of hydrogen is deuterium. But if you split that, you get both neutrons and protons emitted. And you'd have the same number of both. So what I'm saying is that in this hypothesis, that the neutrons then shifted the carbon date forward for the shroud from 33 AD. So I believe that it is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus. But neutrons shifted the carbon date forward from about 33 AD to the range of 1260 to 1390 AD. And the protons that were emitted in the same events then would have formed the images, both the front and the back, full-size images of a crucified man on the shroud, with these images, front and back images, full-size, being identical to how Jesus was crucified, scourged and crucified, as indicated in the New Testament. So that all those factors become very interesting. So that I think at this point, I'm trying to finish up 2 papers at this point. One paper for a presentation I made at a Christian apologetics conference at the Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina, April 1st of this year, and another one coming up in Italy, November 28th to the 30th, to a group of specialists in non-destructive testing. So that's how that's kind of an update of where we are. But I guess I'd like to go into some of the questions that arose from the previous podcast. Would that be okay?
Yes, let's do that.
Okay.
As I said before, I tried to take on some of them or forward some of them, but there's a lot. A lot of folks watch that video and continuing to, and hopefully we'll watch this as well and spread around. If you know someone else who has this question and you're watching this, you can share it with them. So yes, please.
Yes. Okay. So I picked out 23 questions, which are probably more than we can talk about, but then I also picked out some of the more significant ones. So I'll take it from the most recent question and then go back in time here. So You refer, and I'll just read off to the side here. You refer to an event that is beyond or outside of our current understanding of the laws of physics. That's how I like to phrase it. I have tried saying that, but the response is, this is a God of the gaps argument. If you can't explain something, why is it automatically God? Why we should wait for technology and science to explain it instead of throwing in your invisible sky daddy. And they put that in quotes. Well, the sky daddy comment just indicates that the person who wrote this likes to ridicule maybe Christianity and maybe the Shroud. This is unnecessary to have this kind of language.
Right.
But anyway,
I've seen it many, many times.
Yeah, many, many, many times. And the basis of this whole question is a presupposition of naturalism. That is, when you're dealing with a subject, especially regarding the Shroud, you have to question your presuppositions. It's a presupposition of naturalism. Okay, well, what is naturalism? Naturalism is a presupposition you make before you look at the evidence. It's a presupposition that the only allowed explanations are those that are consistent with our current understanding of the laws of physics. That's what naturalism is. Well, there's no basis for that assumption. It is just an assumption. It's kind of our current age assumption, but there's no scientific validity to it. You can't prove that assumption is true based upon repeated experiments in the laboratory. You cannot philosophically prove that statement is true, that naturalism must be true also. So that in this investigation of the Shroud, I think it's very important to be neutral in your presuppositions. That is, you say, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. And so that you're actually investigating the issues based upon science rather than your presupposition in philosophy or theology or religion or anything else. Just look at the science and follow the science where it leads.
And if I may, Bob, real quick, I don't know if this isn't maybe the best analogy, because of course this example that I've just thought of only sort of includes naturalistic explanations. But I almost wonder if it's like, if I came out in the morning and looked at the kitchen table and there was a mysterious image on it, and my mind is trying to process how that image could have been created, and I just arbitrarily rule out the possibility that it could have been paint or something like that. Like I closed the door on a possible explanation, and it really was that thing that I shut the door on. I'm going to refuse to sort of entertain any possibility or evidence that people give me that it could have been that particular means. Whereas, I mean, of course, now that's a natural explanation, but here, or you're saying that, if you immediately shut the door to the possibility of a supernatural or beyond what we can understand just with science alone explanation for this, that's an assumption or presumption that you're making ahead of time.
Yes, and rather than a person arguing against God's existence, they just presume that he can't exist by an assumption of naturalism.
Right.
So I think most people would agree that if God exists, then miracles are possible. So that if you assume that miracles are not possible, that's equivalent to saying that you don't believe in God.
Right.
Well, okay, but that's not doing science. You have to look at the evidence and follow the evidence where it leads. This would be like a detective investigating a murder, and as a presupposition, you assume that it, for political reasons, that it cannot be the mayor's son who committed it. Well, then you can't follow the evidence where it leads.
Yeah.
And so that's all I'm saying. Don't make the presuppositions that limit your thinking, and follow the evidence where it leads. So that, let me read it again. You refer to an event that is beyond or outside of our current understanding of the laws of physics. Well, I like to say that because science has always allowed the possibility that maybe they don't know everything. The history of science is such that there are continually new discoveries because they didn't know everything. And so that's all I'm saying here, is that we have to admit that we don't know everything scientifically. I have tried that saying that, but rather the response is, this is a God of the gaps argument. Well, no, it's not. I'm not mentioning God. I'm not mentioning miracles or the supernatural or anything in this. I'm doing scientific analysis. And it's the person who's asking the question that's bringing up the God idea.
Sure.
We should wait for technology and science to explain it instead of throwing in your invisible sky daddy. How ridiculous. Well, no, we have to take the evidence that we have and look for and allow for the evidence to indicate something that is outside of our current understanding of the laws of physics. For example, when Einstein hypothesized that there were gravity waves, that was way outside the range of people's normal understanding of the laws of physics. Yet gravity waves have now been proven to exist. So when Einstein proposed that, people didn't ridicule him for making a God of the gaps argument. No, of course not. They realized that he was just saying that this is something that is beyond our current understanding of the laws of physics. And that's all I'm saying. I'm not even claiming this is a miracle or supernatural, because I'm doing science. Now, if you start to ask questions related to those topics, I will say, okay, let me take my science hat off and put my Bible believer's hat on and answer your question. So I try and make a clear distinction what we're talking about. And sometimes people say, well, you're not even allowed to talk about God or something, or theology or biblical evidence, whatever. And my response is, why not? Who said that? Why is that true?
Right.
Are there evidence police out there? They're going to hunt me down and punish me for saying this? No, of course not. I'm allowed to talk about history of the Shroud of Turin. I should also be allowed to talk about the theology of the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah,
I've studied it enough. I'm a qualified individual to talk about this. Secondly, are his studies peer-reviewed? Now, I'm often frustrated by this. A lot of people think that if a paper is peer-reviewed, then it's true. And if it's not peer-reviewed, then it's not true.
That's how I hear it largely described a lot of times.
Yes, well, my goodness. I read one article that said that half of the papers that are published in peer-reviewed journals are basically wrong. Well, what happened to the peer review? Why didn't that assure that it was true? And then think about the difficulty in getting an accurate peer review on a paper written for a general audience, which is what my papers are. They're written for the layman. They're not written for, mostly is the case, I've written them for the layman to be understood by the layman, so that I'm avoiding a lot of technical terminology and whatnot, so that they can appreciate the evidence for the Shroud of Turin, and thus make it more likely that we'll be allowed to do testing in the future by a groundswell of public opinion asking for future testing of the Shroud of Turin. But we should judge papers based upon the evidence, not based upon whether they've been peer-reviewed or not. That's what I would say. And to get a good peer review on the Shroud of Turin, you have to have experts on the Shroud of Turin, which scientists are not. They're not familiar with it. So if I turn it into a peer-reviewed journal, I get peer-reviewed by people that are not familiar with the Shroud of Turin. And what good is that? And people who 90 to 95% of the case for scientists make an assumption of naturalism, so that they automatically approach the Shroud with the wrong philosophy. So I encourage people to judge the papers based upon the evidence that you see in them. Let's see what other interesting questions. How can a burial cloth last 2,000 years? This is linen. This is highly resistant to attack by insects. I have a shirt in my closet my mother made for me over 50 years ago. It looks just as good as it did 50 years ago when she made it. There's no problem in cloth lasting almost forever if it's kept dry, away from insects, for cotton, for example, and away from fire. The only other things that would decompose fabric would be oxidation, a normal chemical reaction, and dehydration, removal of the water. And those are very slow processes. Plenty of linen examples go back 4,000 years rather than just 2,000 years. So there's no problem.
Right.
The next one, I'm surprised there hasn't been another carbon test to prove the shroud's age after 20 years rather than just whining about the old test. Scared to test it? Well, the owner of the shroud now, since 1983, officially is whoever the Pope is. He has the final say. And the last time they did scientific testing on the shroud, the authorities in the Vatican were burned by it. The scientists did not keep their promises as to what they were going to do and how they were going to act in the post-processing. And
it was a PR nightmare.
It was a PR nightmare, yes.
Yeah.
And so the question is, why should they test it? They believe that it's true, basically. And so why bring any doubt upon it? What they need to do further testing is an explanation for the carbon dating that is understandable, is scientifically based, and has confirmatory evidence for it. And that's what my explanation for the carbon dating of the shroud is and will be after we do further testing of other things. For example, there is a neutron emission by the body to shift the carbon date on the cloth. Those neutrons would also cause changes in the limestone, specifically calcium 40 in the limestone would absorb a neutron changing to calcium 41, which has a half-life, as it's called, in the hundreds of thousands of years, so would still be present. So that should be testable if we can get a good sample. Also, cloth that was exposed to the neutron burst in the shroud, and that would in the tomb, that would include both the shroud and the sudarium, that's the face cloth of the shroud, sudarium of Oviedo, would have experienced this neutron absorption in the elements and the isotopes in the cloth. And so that if we could get a sample from the Shroud of Turin, or more likely from the sudarium of Oviedo, we would then test for chlorine 36 to chlorine 35 ratio. And so that if we can get some of this confirmatory evidence, that it would go a long way in promoting a willingness to do carbon dating of the shroud. Another good idea is to simply take the shroud as we have it and lay a series of film radiation detectors across the shroud. And after a year, then take those and measure them for radiation release. Because some of these items that would have been formed on the shroud should still be radioactive. So there's multiple different ideas there. Next question. I don't think that it's Jesus because many other people were crucified and buried just like Jesus. So how do we know that this shroud belongs to Jesus and not just another unfortunate person that was also crucified? Who is to say it is Jesus? Could be someone else. Well, who is to say it's Jesus? That's easy to answer. Me. I'll say it's Jesus based upon the scientific evidence. Yes, there were many people that were crucified, but not in the way that Jesus was crucified.
This has come up a lot.
Yes. And you look at it, the spear wound in the side, the crown of thorns, these would be unique items to Jesus. So that when we say that the front and back images on the shroud show a crucified man that was crucified and scourged, for that matter, identical to how Jesus is described as being done in the New Testament, that's very significant. So that it only applies, as far as we know, it only applies to Jesus. So then, what is the reason for then claiming that it really is Jesus? Okay, yeah. So maybe it could have been an image from a person who volunteered to be crucified, just like Jesus was crucified. And so what is the evidence? Okay, first, there's two criteria, I think, that you can use to identify who this individual was. The first criteria is that he was crucified and scourged exactly as Jesus was crucified and scourged according to the New Testament. Second evidence is that the image was formed by a burst of radiation from his body, and the carbon dating was shifted by neutron emission from the body, from the dead body, so that we have a radiation burst from the dead body that created the image and shifted the carbon date. That could only be Jesus in the resurrection. There's no other option. That's why I say that I'm qualified to make the judgment that it is Jesus. Very simple. Number 11, next one here. I'm going down through my list. The main argument against authenticity is that the dimensions are not correct. Well, I'm not sure what he's referring to. There's the dimensions of the shroud. I don't think that's it. The dimensions of the height of the body, maybe that's it. The height of the body is usually quoted as about 5'10", which and the average maybe in Jerusalem was maybe 5'8". So maybe it was a little bit high, but you realize that he was from Galilee. He wasn't from Jerusalem. He was born in Bethlehem, true, but raised in Galilee. So who knows?
But I know some people talk about the fingers seeming too long, but that seems like a very subjective,
Yes, the problem with that is that they're not looking at fingers. Mm-hmm. They're looking at bones in the hand below the skin. Yeah. So, very, very different. Next question here. It could have been a self-portrait by Leonardo da Vinci.
There it is.
Well, no. Leonardo da Vinci was born in 1452 and died in 1519. The shroud was shown in Loret, France, as the burial cloth of Jesus in about 1355. This is before Leonardo da Vinci was born. It'd be pretty hard for him to do a self-portrait of himself before he was born.
I wrote back to someone who had made that claim, and all they did was come back and say, well, the one that we have is a replacement of the one that they had in the 1300s, and they kept it secret. To which I said, well, where's your proof for that? So,
yes, maybe it was imported by aliens out of a flying saucer.
At some point, right? That you can make any argument you want, but
yes. Okay. Let's see. Can we go to the tomb and test the rock? We've already discussed that. Check for the calcium 41-40 ratio. If the image was caused by neutrons, well, I'm not saying the image was caused by neutrons. Let's be careful here. I'm saying that the image was caused by protons. Okay. The neutrons caused the shift in the carbon date. That's what I'm saying. If the image was caused by neutrons or light passing through the fabric, then why does the discoloration only penetrate a couple of microns of the outer layer of the thread? Well, now, first of all, we're not really talking about the thread. We're talking about fibers in the thread. But that's where the extreme superficiality shows up. That the discoloration on a fiber is less than 0.2 micrometers, with the diameter of the fiber about 15 micrometers, about 1/5 the diameter of a human hair. If the radiation passed through the, let's say, fibers, then the entire fiber would be discolored and not just the outer layer. This is true. This is an observation that has to be used in developing the correct explanation for the image on the shroud. The discoloration is less than 0.2 micrometers all the way around the circumference of the 15 micrometer fiber. What would cause that? So that it's not radiation going all the way through the fiber. It's doing this. The image was not caused by radiation damage from radiation going through the fibers and threads. I think that's an important distinction to make and is utilized in my development of my explanation for the image on the shroud. The only thing that I could think of that would cause such a discoloration all the way around the circumference of the fiber was a high frequency alternating current in the fibers, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
We have two types of electricity, direct current where the electrons are flowing in a straight line, or we have alternating current with the electrons going back and forth. But a high frequency alternating current in a conductor will cause alternating fields, electric and magnetic fields, which force the electrons to flow in the very outer circumference of the conductor, just where we have the discoloration on the fibers.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So, and this was the only thing that I could think of. This is the most difficult part of any hypothesis to explain. Why this discoloration is so thin all the way around the outside circumference, but the inside is not affected at all. This would occur due to a high frequency alternating current in the fibers. Well, what would cause the high frequency alternating current in the fibers? What we're talking about here, it is electrostatic or corona discharge, I think, from the top fibers on the cloth that were facing the body. It would be like miniature lightning bolts. Now, in a lightning strike, the lightning doesn't just come down from the cloud. It goes back and forth up to 20 different times, so that you have electron flow in a lightning strike. You have electron flow not only in the cloud, but also in the ground.
Right.
So it's discharging the area around where this lightning strike took place from the cloud down to the tip of the lightning rod.
You can see that in hyper slow motion footage, like when you see the discharge coming up and then connecting.
Yes.
Or you see, because it doesn't seem that way if you just witness it with your naked eye. You don't necessarily see that, but to slow it down, that's something that you can see.
Yes, that's true. So I'm saying that the only explanation that I could think of for this phenomenon on the Shroud of Turin is a high frequency electrical alternating current in the fibers. And that's why all of these other simplistic ideas, maybe the shroud was caused by someone rubbing charcoal on the fabric. Well, no, that wouldn't explain this feature.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Nor would paint, dye, scorching, all the other ones that are suggested, which have been demonstrated to not be the explanation anyway. But even if it was, that wouldn't account for it.
Yeah. So what I'm saying in answer to this question is that the discoloration that forms the images of the fibers was not due to the radiation damaging the molecules as it went all the way through the fibers and threads. Rather, it was due to probably protons depositing their charge on the fabric. So it could be a very surface effect. But then that didn't even cause the discoloration. That charge would then flow to the point where the electrostatic or corona discharge was taking place between the top fibers facing the body and the body. And so that this explanation not only explains why the extremely thin discoloration occurred on the fiber, but also why the images of the crucified man were made by a modeled discoloration of the fibers on the shrouds. Some areas were discolored, other areas were not. This is the same thing as it happens in a lightning strike. You have lightning occurring one place, it discharges the surrounding area in the cloud and the ground, so that lightning doesn't occur there, very unlikely to occur there the next time. It occurs somewhere else, thus creating a modeled pattern of lightning strikes. Isn't that interesting?
Wow.
So I'm comparing this image formation to what we know about how lightning occurs.
Right.
Okay.
Wow.
So
it's the first I've heard that, by the way.
Oh, yes. Well, this is brand new.
Yeah.
No one else is saying this. Okay.
Wow.
Next question. The problem with Rucker's theory is that it is almost entirely speculation. Oh, my goodness. There's no details here. What is he talking about? What has he read of my papers? He hasn't read my detailed description of the image formation because they haven't been published. They're not available. I sent it to you, one of them, but it's not been published. So what is he talking about? This is actually a fairly common objection to my theory. And this is a complaint that is either done by people who buy into naturalism, that it simply cannot be anything an event that is outside of our current understanding of the laws of physics, or this is said by someone who simply cannot allow the Shroud of Turin to be evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, which I believe that it is, based upon the scientific evidence. So what do you say if you cannot allow, based upon your religious and philosophical assumptions, if you cannot allow for the Shroud of Turin to be evidence for the resurrection of Jesus? How do you respond to that? You respond to it by doubting the evidence. Okay?
Or just dismissing it altogether. Yep.
Yes. Now let me go on with this question here. It's based on the fact that the Oxford sample was dated to a range slightly different than the Zurich and Arizona, different than the range of the Zurich and Arizona experiments. And from that, he extrapolated a gradient of dates across the entire shroud. Well, this is untrue. There's no basis for him saying this. He doesn't understand what I'm talking about. What I did was that I took the actual evidence from the carbon dating experiments, and I believed it. Now, what he's saying here is that he doesn't believe it. He says that there was a measurement error. I'm believing it. Okay, that's the more scientific approach to take, rather than to say, well, I just don't like your conclusion, so I'm going to doubt the evidence. That's not good science.
Right.
So, yes, so that let's deal with this. Yes, when I look at the experiments from the 3 different laboratories, I recognize that the dates that they are obtained are not consistent with the uncertainties, so that something strange is going on here. How do you deal with that? One way is to do exactly what I did, come up with a theory that's consistent with the evidence. And so then based upon that theory of neutron emission from the body, I then calculated the dates across the entire shroud. I didn't just extrapolate the evidence. I used the evidence to develop a hypothesis, which I then used in my nuclear analysis computer calculations to calculate the dates across the entire shroud. But much different than what this question said. He said it fits the fact. That's right. What I've done fits the facts. But the far more plausible explanation is that the Oxford sample was cleaned in a slightly different way than the other samples. Well, sure, that's a possibility, and you say that in a simple sentence, and who's going to doubt it? It's written. It must be true. It's written right there. But is it true? Well, you check into it. Well, to test this concept, they actually did experiments on the Shroud of Turin in the dating in 1988, when they did the dating of the Shroud of Turin. They not only dated the samples from the Shroud of Turin, but they also dated 3 standards. That's a term they use for it. 3 standards where they dated other pieces of cloth with known dates from the history of those pieces of cloth. And so they were testing whether their experimental procedures, their experimental equipment and chemicals, whatever they're using, whether it gave the correct dates for these 3 other standards. And the result was that their results for these 3 other standards, they were internally consistent between the 3 laboratories, and they were consistent with the historical dates. So in other words, they proved that the procedures and all the equipment was adequate to do carbon dating. Okay? Okay, and so that then, I think, eliminates this objection. They tested for that, and they found that it was inadequate. I don't think there's been any adequate explanation of how the Oxford date could be wrong to produce the perception of a gradient in the date. Now, okay? So that would be my answer to this issue. I've dealt with so many questions. There are answers to all these. A much simpler answer to the carbon dating is they took the sample from where it had been repaired. This is the invisible repair hypothesis, or invisible reweave hypothesis. There is a video on who figured it out and how it was proved to be true. Well, there's not just one video. There's 2 videos on this topic, and I've reviewed them, and I have noted my objections to them. I don't think they're valid, those 2 videos that are being referred to here. And there's multiple reasons for this. Mike, I think in the paper that I did send you, my preliminary paper that's not published yet, I included 10 different reasons why I do not believe the invisible reweave hypothesis. The next question here is, Ray Rogers discovered that cotton was added to the repair area, which was done in the 1200s. Well, no, that's not the concept. Joe Marino came up with the concept of the invisible reweave hypothesis, and his speculation is that the reweave was done about in the early 1500s, maybe 1520 or so. It wasn't. He's not saying it was done in the 1200s, so that's an error. And that the shroud was pure linen. Well, how do we know that? We don't know that it was 100.0000% linen. That's never been tested for that. Ray Rogers said that he discovered cotton in the repair area. Well, no, the repair areas were burned for the carbon dating. So Ray Rogers didn't have that. What he had was an area near where the carbon dating samples were taken from. And so he found cotton there. Now, cotton, it's very distinctive from linen. Linen looks like bamboo with the little nodes on it, whereas cotton fiber has kind of a twisted appearance. So it's easy to look at. But I have, in all of my years, I've been working on this for about 10 years, I have never seen a study, a systematic study, a detailed systematic study of the Shroud of Turin to determine whether there is cotton fibers in other locations across the shroud. Ray Rogers just makes the claim, unsupported claim, that the cotton doesn't exist on the Shroud of Turin. Well, he found some. There's multiple sources for cotton on the Shroud of Turin. In 1978, for example, when the 26 researchers from STURP, Shroud of Turin Research Project, went to Turin, Italy to do experiments on the Shroud of Turin, they all wore cotton gloves.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
They all wore cotton gloves. My goodness, are you telling me that all those people wearing cotton gloves, you can prove to me that not one fiber of cotton came off those cotton gloves and landed on the Shroud of Turin?
That's a good point, because I was going to ask, because it's been brought up before on this program, some folks I've interviewed, pointing out, potentially pointing out lines of evidence or things that you would hope to, or that you would expect, I should say, to find if it were authentic and in line with, for example, like Jewish burial customs. And that's been brought up before about linen under Jewish burial rituals and law, not having any other mixed fibers in with it, like cotton and that sort of thing. But I hadn't thought about what you just said there, that it could just be something as simple as centuries and centuries of time when it could have gotten, so even if the entire cloth was perfectly pure 2,000 years ago and not mixed with cotton, there's no way to account for the prospect of cotton fiber coming in contact with it at some point over a vast amount of time.
Yes, typically when the shroud goes on display, you have 2 to 3 million people file past it. And now, it probably has a thick cover over it that you have to look through. So that would protect it. But in the old days, there'd be thousands, maybe millions of people in the old days that would be in the area, and a lot of them would be wearing cotton fabric. Or are you going to try and prove that none of them had cotton fabric on?
Right.
It just kind of, and he doesn't say whether the cotton fiber that he found was just on the surface of the fibers and threads, or whether it was embedded in the twisted linen fiber.
Sure.
He doesn't say. Yeah, that's crucial.
That's a good point.
Very poor evidence. Very poor evidence. So he later said that he found a thread with cotton on one end of the thread and linen on the other thread. I don't believe that. Where is it? Show it to me. I want to look at it. under the microscope. It should be easy. If it was true,
Mm-hmm.
where is it? Bring it forward. Let other people look at it, because it's not credible that a cotton thread made up of 100 or more cotton fibers could be interwoven with a linen thread composed of 100 or more linen fibers in a way that would wrap each cotton fiber around each linen fiber. That's not credible. That's impossible. Now, in the video that's shown, it shows one cotton fiber wrapping around one linen fiber, though it calls them threads. They're not threads, they're fibers. There's a frequent confusion between fibers and threads. But the video shows this wrapping, but it shows the cotton fiber wrapping itself around the linen fiber. That's fiction. There's no mechanism for doing that. And the invisible reweave process, if you read the literature, it was done by a needle pulling cotton fibers, cotton threads into the old material, so that it would not interweave the fibers, the new fibers, with the old fibers. That's not part of the process of French invisible reweaving, as it's called.
Interesting.
Isn't it? There's lots of objections, of objections to this. So that's kind of my survey of the most important questions that came up from the last podcast. Do you have any other comments or questions?
No, I think I'm good for now, because I'd love to be able to get to as much as we can here. I can go longer than I originally was thinking here too, because I want to make sure we get to these as many maybe of these evidences that you mentioned. If you want to.
Yes, back to the question here.
Yeah.
That what I did was just all speculation.
Right.
Well, no, let me go through the evidences that I had to satisfy with my image formation hypothesis. That is, that protons were emitted from the body at the same time as the neutrons. That the protons were emitted from the body, then deposited their charge on the cloth, which then caused an electrostatic or corona discharge from the top fibers that were facing the body, with the electric current going back and forth at a very high frequency, thus causing a high frequency alternating current in the fibers, which cause what we see on the fibers. So let's go. There's 27 different evidences that I had to satisfy. This is not speculation. This is following the evidence where it leads. So number one, according to experiments performed in 1978 over a 5-day period, 120 hours, by about 26 researchers associated with the Shroud of Turin research project, these images have no pigment, no binder to carry the pigment, no outline, no brush strokes, no clumping of fibers or threads, no stiffening of the cloth, and no cracking along fold lines. Well, that evidence proves that the images are not due to paint, dye, or stain. Number two, Shroud concluded that the images were not caused by a scorch from a hot object, any liquid, or by a photographic process. So this helps by excluding possible image formation processes. Number three, there's a smooth gradation of discoloration on the shroud from points that would have been vertically closer to the body relative to points vertically further from the body. This proves that the image was not formed by contact between the cloth and the body. Number four, Stirp also detected no body decay products on the cloth. A lot of results from that. And number five, the images are formed by some of the flax fibers in the linen threads being discolored. So the discoloration, you had to get information from to the cloth that defined the appearance of a crucified man. That information has to control the discoloration mechanism. So this gets very, very detailed. Where did that information have to come from? It had to come from the body. That's the only place that such information would occur. Number six, you stop me if you have questions, okay?
Yeah, no, yeah, keep going. You're good.
Number six, the shroud contains full-size front, and dorsal or back images of a man who was crucified exactly like Jesus was crucified according to the New Testament. We've mentioned this already. Number seven.
I want to encourage people too that bring that up to spend a little more time looking at just how many, because it's more than I think most of us realize, how many unique, distinct features, when you really break it down, factor into that. Jesus' crucifixion versus other crucifixions. So that's a whole other topic.
Yes,
Yep.
yes, that's true. The image of the face is a normal width for a human face. Interesting, because if the cloth was wrapped around his face and then you flatten it out, the image should be wider.
Mm-hmm.
So interesting repercussions to that fact. Number 8, the front image is a vertical projection upward from the body. Very interesting observation. This is a geometrical observation. The back image is a vertical projection downward from the body. That tells us what formed the image. It was vertically oriented, whatever it was. The shroud does not include images of the sides of the body or the top of the head. Why is that? Because what formed the images was vertically oriented. Let's see, number 10. The front and dorsal images have a good resolution, perhaps in the few millimeter range. Well, this shows that it cannot be due to a diffusion process, such as a Maillard reaction.
Right. It's very crisp. It's very high definition. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. It's a good. Not tremendous, but it's a few millimeter range is the resolution, and you'd not get that with a diffusion process. Number 11, based on the location of the blood that is on the shroud, the front and dorsal images are on the side of the cloth that was facing the body. There appears to be a very thin indication of the face and hands on the other side of the cloth, that is on the outside of the wrapped configuration, though this is disputed. Number 12, a typical linen thread contains 100 or more flax fibers twisted together. The images on the shroud are caused by fiber discoloration in only the top 2 or 3 layers of fibers in a thread, with those discolored fibers facing toward the body, both on the front as well as the dorsal image. I've mentioned this before. Number 13, the threads in the images are discolored in a mottled pattern. Yet this mottled pattern forms the front and dorsal images of a crucified man. I've mentioned that. Number 14, the density of ion tracks in the image fibers is about the same as the density of ion tracks in the non-image fibers. Interesting observation. That has to be consistent with your image formation hypothesis. Number 16, a flax fiber has a diameter of about 15 microns or micrometers, which is about 1/5 the diameter of a human hair. The discoloration on the image fiber has a thickness of less than 0.2 micrometers, with the discoloration being around the outer circumference of the fiber, with the inside of the flax fiber not discolored. Thus, in this example of a flax fiber with a 15 micrometer diameter, the inside 14.6 micrometers of the fiber diameter would not be discolored. Number 17, there appears to be images of bones on the shroud. This is doubted by some people, but it's rather obvious. This includes bones near the surface of the body, such as teeth, bones in the hand. We've mentioned that already. Bones in the hands, and perhaps in the backbone. Number 18, the images are two-dimensional, yet contain three-dimensional or topographical information related to the vertical distance from the cloth, from the body to the cloth at each point. And that has to be consistent with your hypothesis, if the hypothesis can be true. And that's what a hypothesis is. Making a hypothesis is not saying this is true. It's saying this could be true.
Right.
Let's test the predictions. Okay, that's how science is done.
Right.
Number 19, the images are negative images with dark and light areas reversed. Number 20, the front and dorsal images have about the same quality, as though they were both made by the same process. Interesting fact. The discoloration, number 21, the discoloration on the image fibers is due to some of the single electron bonds of the carbon atoms being changed to double electron bonds. This is consistent with a dehydration oxidation process for forming the images. Okay, number 22, the Shroud of Turin research project concluded that the discoloration on the fibers is not caused by any material, such as atoms, being added to the fibers. Okay, it's due to something that happened to the atoms that were already in the molecules that made up the fibers. The top threads facing the body create, number 23, the top fibers facing the body create a non-discolored region on otherwise discolored threads that are beneath them, like a shadow of the top thread on the next thread. Interesting observation.
Yes.
There are, number 24, there are multiple hotspots. And this is my observation. I don't think anyone else has said this. There are multiple hotspots on the mustache that are more discolored than the rest of the mustache. Number 25, the images were not affected by heat in the 1532 fire or by subsequent water that was thrown onto the shroud after the fire. Number 26, images of various parts of flowers and possibly also coins over the eyes were encoded on the side of the shroud facing the body, as though the flowers, or coins in this case, were placed over the section of the cloth that was below the body and the section of the cloth that was above the body. In other words, between the body and the upper cloth. And last, number 27, during the Stirp experiments in 1978, many oxidizing and reducing agents were applied to image fibers to determine which agents would eliminate the fiber discoloration. Just testing. None of them eliminated the discoloration except for a chemical called diamite, which eliminated this discoloration immediately when it was applied. Interesting facts. But your any image formation hypothesis that you want to propose or suggest, it has to be consistent with all these 27 items. And so when a person says, well, it was just charcoal, or it was by bitumen, it could have been this or that. Well, have you tested it? If you say that it's so easy, then you do it. And then we'll take a look at the microscopic evidence and show you in what sense these 27 items are not satisfied.
Right. Well, because I was going to ask the obvious question: has anyone come to you yet with an explanation for all 27? No. Obviously, well, but
no. Yes, yeah. Every previous attempt to reproduce the image on the Shroud of Turin has only proven that's not how it was done.
Right. Well, and I brought up the quote because I don't want to mess it up here, but that famous quote from Sherlock Holmes, right? Arthur Conan Doyle, that you see quoted sometimes: when you have eliminated all which is impossible, then whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Yes.
And that seems to be what is undergirding a lot of your own approach to this, of course, right? Propose a hypothesis, examine it, investigate it, see how it doesn't fit the puzzle, and it's very easy, of course, to type up a YouTube comment. I've done it myself once or twice, and sometimes, felt good about myself for a moment or something, but it's not really, doesn't really tend to be a really responsible venue for really profoundly thoughtful inquiry. There can be some good conversation that starts there, that continues there, but I do see that quite a bit. A lot of folks just thanking us for putting this content out there, for getting them to think, sharing some links. But when it starts getting into debates, I commonly see that thread of a lot of missteps, a lot of circular reasoning, a lot of unfortunately sometimes, just like you said earlier, maybe someone who's trying to avoid the possibility of this being real because it would ostensibly require maybe some changes in their life. So, yeah.
Exactly right. People are so hesitant to change their worldview. Their basic positions in life.
Absolutely. Well, we've got a couple minutes left here, Bob. Is there anything, in particular you wanted to, highlight or dig into, or any last minute, thoughts for now? I'm sure we'll catch up with you again,
Yes.
and keep this conversation going.
Yeah, yes, I'm working on 2 papers, as I've mentioned now.
Yeah.
As soon as I finish them, I'm going to be starting on efforts to start my MCNP nuclear analysis computer calculations again to try and extract additional data, additional evidence one way or another, and to develop plots of the ratio of calcium 41 to calcium 40 ratio into the limestone, for example, so that hopefully we can get samples from there's basically 2 different perspective tombs for the shroud, and we'll try and get samples from both.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can find positive evidence for an anomalously high calcium 41 to calcium 40 ratio, then that would show that a nuclear event occurred at that location.
Mm-hmm.
And what would that be? Well, the argument would be that would be where Jesus' resurrection took place.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's fascinating, and I think so we're recording this right now in July of 2023. Folks watching it, it's August now by the time you're watching this, or later, and so we'll have to circle back if not sooner.
Yes.
Maybe circle back to you after that conference in Italy. You have this this fall, and see how that's going.
Yes, and I'm hoping that some of these experiments that we're proposing can take place, but we'll need to have samples. We'll need to have people that are willing to do these types of experiments. We'll have to get permissions from various individuals, and so. But I'm phasing out now of doing research primarily, and writing and doing presentations and podcasts primarily. To now, I'm going to try and start doing experimentation.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting. And I wish you well with it. Thank you so much, though, for joining us again today and unpacking this, and especially for addressing these questions and sharing some new food for thought for everybody. So thank you so much, Bob.
Yes.
God
Glad
bless
to be
you.
here.
It is always such a delight to talk to Bob, and as I mentioned to him there, I want to have him on for sure again at some point, maybe to unpack this conference that he has coming up at the time of this recording in a couple of months, and certainly we'll circle back and check in with him as we often do with some of our guests when it comes to the Shroud of Turin. So God bless you all. Please again subscribe to this channel, share this video far and wide with your friends, family, anyone you think will benefit from it, and until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.